Your first assignment in packaging design is going to be something fairly simple or relatively simple, and that would be designing a label. And I'm going to go into more of the details in the assignment video, which comes after this one. But before we do that, I wanted to cover a little bit of the history of labels and also talk about some of the trends that we see today in designs for labels. Labels are a very important part of packaging. Uh, what we would consider labels, really, if you go all the way back to ancient Egypt, there needed to be a way that you could identify what was in various containers. But to get to something we would recognize as a label, really you have to jump ahead to the 1700s. And with the introduction of glass bottles, and especially in the winery business, there needed to be a way to differentiate the different types of wine, the different vintages. And that's where you see this paper label that we would recognize today really came into usage. Labels also took off as an extension of the markings that would be seen on crates or on casks because obviously you couldn't see into them what was in there. There needed to be a way to see what was in there. So the labels could be mechanically produced and not have to be painted by hand on there. Once you get into the 1800s, drug labels were really the first to come into common usage. And this is the era when what we consider the middle class really started taking off. And you had people with disposable income, and they could afford to spend their money on various remedies here. And what you see is these really elaborate label designs done in a Victorian style. And we're going to talk about the various different styles you might want to consider for your label design. You are not reading that wrong. Once upon a time, you could buy heroin over the counter, but over time, people thought better of that. There are friends, the Smith brothers. They're in this label lecture to just remind you that they were the first to create a trademark for their graphics, and so that ties into label design as well. Once you get into the later 1800s, attention really shifts to our backyard here in Orange County. The golden age of labels in the US really coincided with these really elaborate, beautifully printed and lithographed labels from all the produce or farms and producers in Southern and Central California. And these labels were really quite elaborate. Again, you're trying to reach the consumer. And when you're selling oranges, you want to make sure your oranges look better than the others. Here you can see from our neighbors in Placentia some of their labels. And then here's some from Fullerton. And what's interesting about this, if you ever wanted to know where Chapman Avenue, where Fullerton College is located, got its name, you can see on the right label, Charles C. Chapman, one of the fathers of the city in the early days. Fullerton is not known for their bald eagles, but that doesn't prevent them from putting it on the orange label. The one I find really fascinating here is Fullerton was and is one of the few cities in the area that actually had its own airport. And so by putting an airplane on the label, I guess they were implying that we airshipped all the oranges. That wasn't the case. They shipped by rail. But if you're trying to woo people and thinking your produce is the freshest, I guess kind of convincing them it traveled by air would be helpful. Some more examples of local orange crate labels. And again, you can see a variety of themes on here. It wasn't just oranges. You can see lemons, asparagus, avocados as well. But you can also see some various themes that crop up over and over again. Once you get into the 1900s, the original Food and Drug Act passed in 1906, and that it made it illegal to transport any products that had labeling that was misbranded and or adulterated, especially with food, drinks, and drugs. Up until now, you never really knew what you were getting in your product. You only had the manufacturer's say so on what was inside, and so this made it illegal to put not legal ingredients on there, or trying to fool people into thinking it was something it's not. Moving a little further, 1924, the Supreme Court ruled that the Food and Drugs Act condemns every statement, design, or device on a product's label that mislead or deceive, even if technically true. So that comes into stretching the truth. Now you'll see here on the lecture a label for snake oil. Back in the day, people would sell these bottles labeled snake oil, and they would be rumored to cure just about anything that ailed you, and you were never really sure exactly what was in it. It certainly was not oil from a snake. So when you hear that term snake oil being used, that usually means someone's trying to sell you a bill of goods on whatever they're trying to peddle to you. The 1930s, this is also kind of a local story. R. Stanton Avery was the first one to come up with a self-adhesive label. Avery Labels, or Avery Dennison, is still a major industry, and they are based up in LA. And before this, if you had labels on anything, a crate of oranges or a bottle, they would have to be glued on by hand or in a factory. With the self-sticking labels, it made it much easier for you to label whatever you needed to label. I'm going to take a little detour here in Fullerton. I'll just, since we're talking about labels. In 1927, a young man, already probably a little wealthy from his family, moved to Fullerton and purchased a company here called Valvita. His name was Norton Simon, which you may recognize. After several years and several mergers, the company was renamed into Hunt Foods, which I'm sure you've heard before, and they were actually headquartered here in Fullerton. It was such a huge operation that Norton Simon hired a world-famous architect from LA, William Pereira, to design this whole campus, which is still standing in West Fullerton. And Norton Simon, through Hunt Foods and other companies he owned, became quite wealthy, and with his wealth, he amassed an amazing art collection. And back in the day, had you gone to the Hunt campus in West Fullerton, you would see a Rembrandt hanging in the lobby, and you would see Rodin sculptures out in the plaza. And Norton Simon was actually a resident of Fullerton, and in the 1960s, he offered to build a world-class art museum here in Fullerton. The city somewhat unceremoniously declined him. Their reason was they were afraid a museum in little old Fullerton would attract hippies. This was 1964. So Fullerton's loss became, Pasadena's gain. And now if you ever watch the Rose Parade every January 1st, you'll see the Norton Simon Museum prominently featured in downtown Pasadena. 1965 Fair Packaging and Labeling Act. This really just pushed the legal requirements further, and made you honestly and informatively tell you exactly what was in the product. And so you can see here tomato puree, vegetable oil, cheese, flavorings, which is a little vague. Salt, spices is also a little vague as well. But from 65, you had to do that. 1973, this was the first label for certified organic farmers. And organic is a very big thing now, but back then it was really considered kind of a niche market. 1990, you get this label that we all see on almost everything in the grocery store. Each of these labelings or each of these laws basically just kind of locked in the legal requirement of what you could put on your product. So now, in addition to saying exactly what the ingredients are, you have to tell how many calories, what the total fat and cholesterol and whatnot are on there. So again, these are all designed so that consumers have a real true vision of what they're buying. This label, in fact, was redesigned about 3 or 4 years ago. You're going to become much more familiar with it in the weeks to come. 1995, the American Heart Association has their label that can be put on food for food that is healthy, heart healthy. 1999 or 98, fair trade. So you'll see a lot of brands, especially in the coffee and tea space. What this means is it means that they paid a fair price for the ingredients, be it tea leaves or coffee beans, that they're not, paying someone in another country peanuts and then reaping huge profits off it. 2002, this is the latest updating of the organic label. You can see it's become much more clean. And the organic food sector of the food industry has grown wildly since the 1970s and is a major slice of the produce and food market. This one I love, 2009. A lot of the companies that make things that are horribly not good for you, like Fruit Loops, began to fear they were going to get labeled out of existence, that once people saw all the real legal labels, that people would be deterred from buying their various products. So Kellogg's and a lot of other manufacturers came up with this really kind of deceptive labeling regime. You can see it at the top of the Fruit Loops box there, those little green tabs at the top, and even the little check on there. These are not legal. They are not backed by anything, but it's to try and kind of convince people, if you read the fine point, that actually, no, Fruit Loops is really good for you. So you'll see that on a lot of products. I think they're trying to phase it out because it really is, if not, it's pretty deceptive. So I don't know legally how much longer they're going to be able to get away with it. Had to throw this in there, my gratuitous dachshund image. And later in the semester, you're going to be working on a beverage container or a beverage branding assignment. Part of that's going to be designing a label that goes on a bottle. And since we're talking labels, I just wanted to alert you that whenever you're designing a label that's going to go on anything cylindrical, such as cans or bottles, you have to remember that there's a very small area that is facing directly at the viewer in a grocery store aisle. If you design a really wide label, remember it's going to start wrapping around the sides of the bottle. So if you put important information off to the far left or far right, you could be in a situation where your viewer is only looking at a partial word. So the green area here is roughly what would be visible from a store shelf this is the top view of it. As you get into the yellow area, things become a little harder to read. And then once you get into the red area, if you have a label that extends that far, you're really not going to be able to read it unless you pick the object up and rotate it around. And then talking about some contemporary design labels here, I've thrown in a lot of styles in here. We're going to talk more in one of the next lectures about various graphic design styles you may want to consider. But this is just kind of, I threw in a lot of stuff I've collected that I thought was good packaging. I put this one in here because it's relative to your assignment. You are being asked to design a label for a fruit clamshell packaging, but one option you have is to design something like this. We call this a belly band, and it's actually one long label that will wrap either just across the top lid or completely around the package. More graphics that might be relative to this assignment. We'll talk about some trends in a minute, but pattern is one. Here, if you're wondering why I asked you to kind of try and learn all these photographic skills before we dove in on this assignment, here's a couple examples of using photography. So it's hard to tell in this, but this is that black and white mezzotint. Here's another example of using photography, but using it exactly how I had you do it in the assignment with the black mezzotint image on top of kind of the craft paper, brown paper background. More examples in here of labels in different styles. We'll talk more about that. This is more of a tag. Here you can see more pattern again. So some of the trends you see a lot today are typographic. That's actually through the typography you choose and how you design it, basically turning the type into a little piece of art. So here's some labels in that style. Here's a more modern take as a tag. And then here's some other examples of that are a little more relative to the assignment. Here's, again, a type design done in a more vintage or retro style. Clean and minimal is also a real big trend in label design these days. So here you can see some very clean, simple typography. Painterly backgrounds also are huge right now. So you might see that in a lot of packaging and especially in the beverage market, a lot of that kind of painterly technique or texture. I mentioned earlier, pattern is really big right now. You'll see that in a lot of products, especially labels. This is interesting. This idea of labeling or layering. This is really huge right now, and it's actually mimicking mistakes. Back in the day with printing, when it wasn't really exact, things wouldn't exactly line up, or sometimes a printer would actually accidentally put one printed piece in the press and print over it. And so this layering technique, or we call it overprinting, the look is really kind of current right now. I think part of the reason it's so attractive to people is it really kind of implies a little bit of a human hand in there. And since we all live our lives in a digital space, looking at something that looks kind of like it was hand printed and it's a little bit off and maybe not perfect, I think appeals to people on that on that level. Another trend is die cuts. Die cuts are whenever you, in the printing process, you cut anything. It could be cutting a shape. So you can see in the Atom logo there, it's kind of being die cut into this amoeba shape. You'll also see die cuts where you cut a window. You can see that in the one labeled number 1 on here. Here's some other examples. Especially on the blue hugs, that's one big label and it wraps around the bottle, and it's just a real clever concept for packaging design. Here's a window that's been die cut out of this label. And one of the things with cutting windows, especially on a glass bottle here, it's a great way to actually show the product through it. And with labels, you don't have to worry about the structural integrity so much. When you're doing die cuts for, say, publication design, you have to make sure you never cut away enough that you're going to make the thing start tearing apart. But with labels, you don't really have to worry about it. Something as simple as just taking a rectangle and doing this kind of arc cut across it, allowing you to see the product inside. You can do specific shapes, and here you can see the strawberry label, which is what you're going to be working on. So the whole label has been cut out as one shape with the illustration and the type. Here's a more kind of geometric shape with the illustration on it. Here you can see the window cut out. So different options. Labels as art. This you see a lot in the beverage space, especially when you'll see different brands actually come up with like collector bottles. Shiny, this doesn't really appeal. Well, I shouldn't say that. You could print on metallics. Again, this is more in the beverage space, so this, in the back of your mind, think about this possibly for your beverage assignment. Illustration, again, I think this ties into the need or desire to see a human hand in things, and so you're seeing more of this kind of hand-done illustration style. And then various styles. I'm going to go over them more in depth in one of the next lectures, but this is one, Art Deco, kind of a modern take on Art Deco. Art Deco was huge, started in the 20s and through the 30s. It is a style that everyone loves, and it keeps popping up. It had a huge resurgence in the 80s, and it's having a huge resurgence again now. So that might be something to consider, but we'll go over other styles in one of the next lectures.